On the evening of January 6, North Korea likely conducted its fourth nuclear weapons test. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un claimed that the test was a fusion reactive hydrogen bomb. Most experts are skeptical, given seismic evidence and North Korea's penchant for overstatement, but it's nonetheless incredibly concerning. We convene this hearing today not only to join the international community in condemning the test, but to work to find a feasible, lasting solution to address the North Korean nuclear threat. For many in the United States, if we think of North Korea, it's usually the butt of a joke, a reference to either The Interview or Team America movies. Despite repeated calls from both respectable civilian thinkers and top military leadership citing North Korea as a top threat in the Pacific theater, North Korea seems to have been off the Obama administration's radar. Instead, they've dismissed the imminent threat by employing its so-called strategy of patience, strategic patience. For our allies in the region, North Korean provocations mean so much more, and it should for the United States as well. History has proven that North Korea has every intention to continue advancing its nuclear program in an effort to strengthen both domestic and international positions. The United States has shown a willingness to negotiate with North Korea if it's simply willing to first take steps toward denuclearization. North Korea has shown no interest in doing so, but it has successfully extracted food assistance and other foreign assistance from us by threatening nuclear activity. This is an unacceptable cycle that cannot continue. Due to North Korea's nuclear threat and proximity to our allies, South Korea and Japan, our response options are limited, but they largely fall into two categories: sanctions and information flow. Some argue for United Nations sanctions, but others say that would exert little pressure on North Korea, largely due to China's lack of enforcement. Some speak of North Korea as the most heavily sanctioned state in the world, but that's simply not the case. For example, Iran is subject to sanctions under 18 U.S. executive orders, and North Korea is subject to 6. I applaud Chairman Royce for his work on the North Korea sanctions legislation, which passed the House yesterday. I'm proud to vote for that, and I think it's a good start, but I think much more to be done, and that's why we're here today. China's relationships with North Korea continues to be a problem. China favors North Korea's status quo over the demise of the Kim regime, which it fears could mean a unified United States-allied Korea as a neighbor and a sizable flood of refugees crossing their border. These vested interests are why China continues to prop up this pariah state with food, oil, and assistance. I'm deeply disappointed that China continues to allow North Korea to destabilize the region in this manner. China must tighten sanctions and really enforce the sanctions that are in place and apply the unique pressure that only it, North Korea's patron, can provide. While a nuclear test quickly draws the world's attention toward North Korean leadership, we must remember that there are 24 million people living in this closed-off state, starved of basic necessities. Furthermore, citizens are brainwashed into believing that their leadership is actually helping them. The North Korea Human Rights Act of 2004 initiated radio broadcasting to provide basic knowledge of the outside world to the people of North Korea. 12 years have since passed and technological advances have been made, and our policies should reflect that reality. I intend to introduce legislation that would update this program to provide greater, more useful information to inform and empower their citizens. In 2006, North Korea was removed from the state sponsor of terrorism list in an attempt to bring it to the negotiation table and ultimately halt its nuclear program. Congress has debated this issue, and many members believe it should be put back on the list. Count me in that category. Given the Sony cyber attacks, the shelling of South Korean ships, North Korea's alleged ties to Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, and now this fourth nuclear test, perhaps nuclear should be placed back on the list. The leaders of North Korea, as well as China, should understand that every Pyongyang provocation will induce a congressional response in an attempt to alter North Korea's ways. There is calamity across the globe, blurring our focus, but the Obama administration's employment of strategic patience comes, I believe, at our peril. Let's be done with strategic patience. It's time for strategic clarity. We must be proactive in our efforts, and I look forward to this important discussion of any recommendations this distinguished panel can offer. Members present will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record, and without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record subject to the length limitation in the rules. And I would like to turn the time over to the ranking member for any comments that he might make.
Thank you. North Korea probably tested a hydrogen-boosted device, one that made use of hydrogen isotopes, but did not get its power from the fusion of hydrogen atoms. That being said, it's perhaps half a decade or a decade before North Korea tests a genuine thermonuclear weapon. I'm sure our witnesses will be able to clarify and give us a more precise estimate. We have, throughout this century, which is now in its 16th year, had a policy which has completely failed us as foreign policy, but has achieved what some would argue is the guiding force behind foreign policy, which is meeting domestic political concerns. We have not, neither the last administration nor this administration has slowed down North Korea's nuclear program for any significant time. And continuing this policy or repeating what we've done but only in a louder voice is not going to yield a different result. But our policy has allowed us at times, from various times, to seem tough, and we've avoided offending Wall Street. These are important domestic political objectives which have been fully achieved. So if viewed from the standpoint of being popular domestically, our policy is a success. If we want to protect the world from North Korean nuclear weapons, it's been a complete failure. In terms of what we could do if sounding tough wasn't important, is we could make it clear to China that if there was a unified Korea, American forces would not be north of the 38th parallel and might even be further south. There'd be less reason for them to be there. We do not have any military forces defending any other China neighbor from China. Our troops in South Korea are there to defend South Korea from North Korea. We could offer North Korea a package of aid. That's been done before, but a non-aggression pact that they had asked for, and we refused to provide because Dick Cheney imagined invasion, or at least didn't want to give up that opportunity sometime in the future. But the most important thing we need to do, and the thing we're least likely to do, is to make it clear to China that their access to U.S. markets depends upon them getting tough with North Korea. Wall Street would be aghast if we actually did it, so we won't. So we're likely to continue the current circumstance. China is indeed miffed by what North Korea has done, but is unwilling to change its policy, and of course, China has been miffed by North Korea many times in the past. China will not change its policy unless the reality changes, and the current reality is they have free access to U.S. markets, and that won't be changed if they choose to continue the policy that they've continued throughout this century, which is to subsidize North Korea. So if we wanted a policy that doesn't meet domestic political objectives, simply maximizes the carrots and sticks on North Korea, it would be a matter of non-aggression pact, 38th parallel and the threat of tariffs on Chinese goods if China continues, while always questioning it, but continues a policy of subsidizing North Korea. So my guess is that we'll simply continue to pull our hair out. Obviously, I've done more of that than most of the witnesses, in worry about North Korea, and talk tough, do nothing that offends Wall Street. And if you keep doing the same thing for now a 16-year-old century and expect a different result, that is the definition of insanity. And a final thing I'll ask our witnesses to comment on is whether we would actually get somewhere if we agreed that North Korea could have a very limited number of atomic but not thermonuclear weapons, or is there a real prospect of getting them to be a nuclear-free state? I yield back.
Just wanted to comment for the ranking member. I think that many of the issues that you've raised are thought-provoking and reasonable, and I would like to extend a hand across the partisan divide to work with you in any way, shape, or form to not just pull our hair out, but actually get some results. And if that offends some folks, some special interests, then so be it. I think the more important goal is to have success. I think all the world expects success. And so I just want to say that I think you've raised some legitimate issues that need to be explored, and I intend to work with you to do that.
Look forward to it.
Mr. Rohrbacher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing at a very significant moment. Our relations with both Koreas go back a long way, and I have a long memory. I still remember sitting right here in this room when the Clinton administration was proposing to us that we that we cut a deal, basically, with North Korea, that we would be providing them food and fuel for an agreement not to do what they apparently have been doing, which is, I don't care if we want to call it a hydrogen booster device or a hydrogen nuclear weapon. The fact is they obviously have been spending their money on developing ways of mass murdering other people, while we have been providing them the money for their food and fuel. To say that that is absolutely unacceptable is to put it mildly. And at that time, I indicated, and several other Republicans, I might add, and a couple of other Democrats as well, I might add, pointed out that that's what would happen. And here it has. Surprise, surprise. They have used their resources to develop weapons of mass destruction. We have subsidized them in using our money to provide them food and fuel, which they should be coming out of their how do you say, hydrogen boosting device development budget. Let me suggest that this nuclear explosion, or this, and the obvious continued work that North Korea is doing on nuclear military devices, that should at least put us into a mindset that we have to do something different than what we've been doing. And let me note that President Abe of Japan has made it very, very clear that there are threats to the Pacific, and I would applaud President Abe for reaching out to South Korea at this moment. President Abe of Japan has gone the extra mile to address sensitivities in South Korea that are left over away from World War II. And he needs to be applauded for that, and he needs to also be encouraged to rebuild Japan's military strength so they can work with the United States of America in preserving the peace in that part of the world, instead of having the United States having to carry the entire load on our own. So with that said, I would finish by saying the other factor is, which the chairman mentioned, China. Just as it was obvious that the North Korean regime, as corrupt and belligerent and as repressive as it is, would be using their money to develop weapons while we provided them food and fuel, it is just as evident that they have a relationship with Beijing that puts Beijing into a position of influence in North Korea, if not dominance of North Korea. So let us, again, to the point that we applaud President Abe for reaching out in policies that are going to ultimately bring more stability to that part of the world, let us condemn Beijing for not using its influence in a way that would bring more stability and peace to that region. So we need to work together on this. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for calling this hearing. Looking forward to hearing for specifics and information from the witnesses that will help us develop our policy now as we start into this new era. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman from California, Mr. Barron.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the timeliness of this hearing. A few weeks ago, I had a chance to visit the Republic of Korea, visit with our troops and spend a few days around Christmas with our troops, also visiting with the Korean foreign secretaries, national security folks, et cetera. Also had a chance to go up to the demilitarized zone and chat with our troops, see the Republic of Korea troops on there. The demilitarized zone is an oxymoron. This is one of the most heavily militarized zones in the world, and it is a constant reminder that we are in a ceasefire. We are not in a state of peace. Listening to the remarks of my colleagues, I think it's important for us to learn from what we've tried in the past and so forth. But the conundrum is North Korea is not easy, and it will require partnership with the countries in that region. And in many cases, we all land at the same place, that China really does have to take a leadership role here. China is the one country that does have some leverage with North Korea, but it will take a partnership between the Chinese government, the Russians, Japan, our Korean allies, along with U.S. leadership in order to address this. It is in all of our interest to de-escalate tensions, to try to bring North Korea into the 21st century, and the goal that I think many Koreans have of seeing a reunification. It's not going to be easy. It will take world leadership. It will take the nations, along with the United States, in that region working together, but it can be done if we put our minds to it. And we have to. There is an urgency of now, as indicated by the recent North Korean nuclear tests. It is complicated, and the President talked about the threats that we face in the Middle East. But those are not threats to our very existence as a nation. And North Korea, with a hydrogen bomb, with ballistic missile and ICBM capabilities, are a threat to world stability. And we've got to direct this. There is the urgency of now. And Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with you to kind of navigate this path forward, and it's incredibly important.
Thank you. Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. There's no question that the world has had a problem for a long time with respect to North Korea, particularly their leadership, whether the grandfather or the father or the son now. They're all equally as crazy, I'm afraid, particularly the newest one. But their own people continue to suffer and to starve. They're the most politically isolated country on the globe. Despite that, they continue to have absolute contempt for most of the rest of the world, including their neighbors. With this fourth now in the last number of years nuclear test, and we have reason to believe it's hydrogen, although that hasn't been confirmed necessarily yet, but nonetheless, it's terribly disturbing. I think every administration, from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration to the Obama administration, has failed with respect to North Korea. and that's most unfortunate. And now with the increasing sophistication of their missile systems, the United States is at risk as well. But two countries that are even more at risk are obviously South Korea and Japan. And as my colleague, Mr. Rohrbach from California indicated, China is the key here. China is the only country that has any real influence over North Korea. And the only thing that's going to get China's attention is if those two countries, Japan and South Korea, seriously consider nuclear programs of their own. That's the only thing that's going to get China's attention. It's the last thing China wants. And so I would urge those two countries to think seriously about this. I'm not encouraging them to do it, but even thinking about it and discussing it, I think will get China's attention. And maybe China will finally act to put the pressure on North Korea necessary to get them to back off this insanity of one of the poorest countries on the world spending all their money on nuclear weaponry to threaten the rest of the world. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Is there anybody else that seeks recognition on the panel before? Yep. Mr. Grayson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this hearing. I find this very interesting. I think the focus, what you've heard a lot, is China. What are we going to do to deal with China in terms of the pressure that China has? To me, there are a couple of questions I'd like to understand, before we get into what we have to do to pressure China or to do anything else. That is, what does China want? Where is China at this? Not because of our pressure. Two, I had seen over the past year or so some articles, especially in the New York Times, about Chinese officials, former military officials, retired, talking about the unsustainability of the Kim regime, and that there's a real concern in China about instability in North Korea. I'd like to hear that discussion, that there's going to be pressure from the bottom up. People cannot live under those conditions, and the Chinese know this. The Chinese know, and there are real worries about the Chinese about what that instability is going to lead to in terms of them. So that leads us to the third point. That is, when we talk about China, knowing that China, it's not getting China involved. China is very involved with what are the consequences. It may have its own agenda about what it wants to do with this. The question is, besides pressure on China, and we've heard a lot, and I'm not saying that that's not a potential, what are the ways of partnership with China? What do you see as opportunities at this moment to be dealing with? Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank Mr. Lowenthal. Very insightful thoughts and questions. If there's no other opening statements, then I'm going to move to the panel. First of all, introducing three great experts on this dicey issue. First is Dr. Victor Cha, Senior Advisor and Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It's good to see you again, Dr. Cha. Mr. Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation, and Ms. Bonnie Glazer, who is a Senior Advisor for Asia at the Department of China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We're thrilled to have all of you here today, and thank you for making the time available. First, I'll introduce Mr. Cha, or Dr. Cha, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Sherman, and members of the committee. It really is an honor to speak to you today about a very difficult topic, and that is North Korea. You mentioned, both the Chairman and Congressman Barr mentioned urgency, and I think there is a great deal of urgency. There are elements of deterrence and crisis instability that derive from North Korea's nuclear weapons status that I don't think the North Koreans fully comprehend. And it can also be the case that the North Korean leader, this young North Korean leader, views nuclear weapons as usable weapons rather than as strategic elements of deterrence, valuable only in their non-use. So the urgency is that the result could be a disaster at the cost of tens of thousands of lives, at which point the world is going to wonder why the United States did nothing to stop this before it was too late. So what have we done? In the administration's own words, strategic patience, the policy of strategic patience, had two objectives. The first was to break the cycle of provocations for negotiations that was the flaw of past administrations' policies. Second, the concept was that this idea of pressure and non-dialogue would eventually cause the North Koreans to feel compelled to come back to negotiations, genuinely willing to cut a deal. When this did not work, the administration did try to reach out and engage, but all these offers have been spurned by the regime. So we are in the worst of all worlds right now. There's no diplomacy, there's more tests, a growing program, a new cycle of provocations. We've had 4 nuclear tests, 3 of them during the Obama administration, 2 of them before the President's State of the Union speech. And at the rate we're going, this issue is just going to get punted to the next administration, and it's going to be an exponentially worse problem. So a new approach to North Korea has to focus on what Bob Gallucci and I described in the New York Times last week as asymmetric pressure points. In my experience being involved in the negotiations in the previous administration, there were only 2 times where I felt like the North Koreans were truly caught off guard, uncertain of how to respond. The first of these was in September of 2005 when the Treasury Department took actions that led to the freezing of North Korean assets at a bank in China. And the second was in February of 2014 in the aftermath of the United Nations Commission of Inquiry report, of which the major recommendation was referral of the North Korean leadership to the ICC for crimes against humanity. These were the only 2 times that I really felt the North Koreans were frazzled. And I think a new strategy has to build on these pressure points. Let me just highlight a couple of these. First is sanctions, and I know Bruce will talk about this as well. As the chairman said, it is a policy myth that North Korea is the most sanctioned country in the world. And the chairman cited some of the statistics for how the sanctioning against Iran is much higher than that against North Korea. So there's plenty more space to operate there. Secondary sanctioning should also be given positive consideration. I know that this has been talked about within policy circles as a significant escalation, and this will certainly complicate our relationships with China, the European Union, Southeast Asia, South America, and Africa. But it's also certain that many of these entities will comply when given the choice of dealing with North Korea or losing access to the U.S. financial system. We should also give serious consideration, as the chairman said, to putting North Korea back on the state-sponsored terrorism list. I know that there will be lawyers who will dispute the legal criteria for putting North Korea back on the list, and here I would only urge that particular attention be given to North Korea's cyber capabilities. We did research at CSIS that shows that the activities, these cyber activities, are instigated by the same agencies, entities within the North Korean government that have been responsible in the past for terrorist acts. Human rights has to complement sanctions as part of an asymmetric strategy. One of the potential targets would be North Korean slave labor. There are over 50,000 workers in Africa, the Middle East, Europe, Russia, and China that are operating in subhuman conditions that are being paid nothing. The revenues all are going back to the North Korean government. There are different estimates between $250 million to over $2 billion of hard currency. So this is certainly something that should be targeted. Another useful asymmetric pressure point is the Kaesong Industrial Complex. This project now provides $90 million in hard currency to North Korean authorities, with little wages actually going back to the factory workers. The South Korean government will probably be opposed to something like this because even conservative governments have grown attached to the Kaesong Industrial Complex. But difficult times call for difficult measures. Lastly, on information, North Korea under Kim has proven to be hypersensitive to external criticism. With renewal of the North Korean Human Rights Act, and I entirely agree with the chairman on the idea of trying to increase funding and basically think about new ways of bringing information into the country. As some of the work that we've done with the Bush Institute has shown, the United States and South Korea can come up with a comprehensive strategy for breaking down North Korean information barriers. Because in the end, we need to improve the human condition of the people in North Korea. Thank you very much.
Cleaner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Sherman and other distinguished members of the panel. It truly is an honor to be asked to appear before you on such an important issue to our national security. North Korea's recent nuclear test has again triggered widespread calls to do something tougher on North Korea. But we've been here many times before, and each time administration claims of tough action were taken at face value, pledges to be even tougher the next time were issued, and interest was eventually diverted elsewhere. More effective action was also hindered by several widely accepted myths about North Korean sanctions. First myth is that sanctions can't affect an isolated country like North Korea. Targeted financial measures, which are a law enforcement mechanism, are directed against specific entities that violate U.S. laws. Even the most isolated regime, criminal organization, or terrorist group is tied into the global financial order. The vast majority of all international financial transactions, including those of North Korea, are denominated in dollars, which means they must go through a U.S. Treasury Department regulated bank in the United States. That gives the United States tremendous power and leverage to freeze and seize assets, to impose fines such as a $9 billion fine imposed on a French bank for improper financial transactions with Cuba, Iran, and Sudan, and also to deny access to the U.S. financial system. As you already pointed out, Mr. Chairman, a second myth is that North Korea is the most heavily sanctioned country in the world. President Obama claims North Korea is the most isolated, the most sanctioned, the most cut-off nation on earth. That's simply not true. The U.S., the European Union, and the UN impose far more pervasive and compelling measures against Iran than North Korea. Also, unilaterally, the United States has targeted far fewer North Korean entities than those of the Balkans, Burma, Cuba, Iran, and Zimbabwe. The U.S. has sanctioned more than twice as many Zimbabwean entities as North Korean entities. We've also designated Iran and Burma as primary money laundering concerns, but not North Korea, which is counterfeiting our currency. The U.S. has sanctioned officials from Burma, Burundi, Congo, Iran, Syria, Sudan, and Zimbabwe for human rights violations, and sanctioned by name the presidents of Belarus and Zimbabwe, but not yet sanctioned a single North Korean entity for human rights violations nearly 2 years after a UN Commission of Inquiry report concluded the regime was conducting such egregious human rights violations as to constitute crimes against humanity. The U.S. has also frozen the assets of Sudan, Iranian, and Syrian, but not North Korean, officials and entities for censorship. The list goes on, and I've included other examples in my written testimony. A third myth is there's nothing more the U.S. can impose on North Korea. After he left office, former Assistant Secretary of State Kurt Campbell commented, "It would be possible for us to put more financial pressure on North Korea. We can make life much more difficult through financial sanctions on North Korea." And he also pointed out he was surprised when he was in government to find out that there were about 10 times as many sanctions on Burma as there were on North Korea. President Obama, Secretary of State John Kerry, and other officials have made similar statements indicating that there are other measures that the U.S. could impose but hasn't. A fourth myth is that sanctions don't work. As Dr. Chaba already pointed out, tougher measures were effective when applied. In 2002, the U.S. designated the Macau-based bank Banco Delta Asia as a money laundering concern for facilitating North Korean illicit activities. As a result of Washington belatedly enforcing its laws, as well as a series of sub rosa meetings by U.S. officials throughout Asia, 24 financial institutions voluntarily cut back or terminated their business with North Korea. And a North Korean negotiator admitted to a senior White House official, "You finally found a way to hurt us." Instead, what the U.S. should be doing is implementing the Iran model against North Korea. Just as strong international measures induced Tehran back to the negotiating table, more robust measures are needed to leverage North Korea. While implementing new sanctions measures is important, fully implementing and enforcing already existing far-reaching measures is also critical. The U.S. has the tools, we've just lacked the resolve to fully use them. For years, the Obama administration has been hitting the snooze bar on sanctions. It's pursued a policy of timid incrementalism by holding some sanctions in abeyance to be rolled out after the next North Korean violation or provocation. The U.S. instead needs to sharpen the choices for North Korea by raising the risk and cost for those violating laws and UN resolutions, not only North Korea, but those that facilitate its actions. In my written testimony, I've provided a lengthy list of very specific recommendations for U.S. and South Korean actions that should be implemented against North Korea. Neither sanctions nor diplomacy alone is a panacea. Both are essential, and along with fully funding U.S. defense requirements, should be mutually reinforcing elements of a comprehensive integrated strategy. I will conclude my presentation with the same question I posed to this committee 2 years ago. Why has the United States hesitated to impose the same legal measures against North Korea that it has already used against other countries for far less egregious violations of U.S. and international law? Thank you again for the privilege of appearing before you.
Thank you, Ms. Glazer.
Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Sherman, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I'm honored to have the opportunity to testify today on this very important issue. As so many of you have already pointed out, cooperation from China, North Korea's main benefactor, is essential to achieving a nuclear-free peninsula. China is North Korea's biggest trading partner. It accounts for 90% of North Korea's global trade, provides at least 70% of North Korea's crude oil requirements, some 80% of its consumer goods, approximately 45% of its food, and China's investment accounts for almost 95% of foreign direct investment in North Korea. The U.S. should not expect Beijing to completely abandon its ally and forge a common strategy with Washington to squeeze North Korea until it gives up its nuclear weapons or collapses. But it may be possible to persuade China to strictly comply with its existing international commitments, to further tighten sanctions on North Korea, and to reduce its support or make continued support contingent on specific actions by Pyongyang to return to its denuclearization pledges. To elicit greater cooperation, the U.S. must attach high priority to North Korea on the U.S.-China agenda, especially in summit meetings between our presidents, U.S. and Chinese leaders. Cooperation on North Korea should be identified as a litmus test of the proposition that the United States and China can work together where their interests overlap. And the U.S. should then take the following steps. First, the U.S. should call out China for its failure to enforce existing UN sanctions. North Korea has deep networks with Chinese companies and uses these relationships to procure prohibited items from all over the world, routing them through China before onward shipment to North Korea. Designated North Korean entities continue to do business with Chinese companies and visit Chinese ports. North Koreans are reportedly still able to conduct banking transactions in small banks operating in northeast China along the border. China does not enforce the ban on luxury goods. Second, the U.S. should press Beijing to agree to the designation of more North Korean individuals and entities in new UN Security Council resolution. Third, the U.S. should encourage Beijing to use its leverage over North Korea in targeted ways to pressure for change in its behavior. China could refuse to engage in new economic projects with North Korea until the government returns to negotiations in good faith. Beijing could reduce the flow of Chinese tourists to North Korea, which has become a significant source of foreign exchange. Fourth, the United States should encourage China to leverage its assistance to North Korea to influence its behavior. So to deter North Korean long-range missile launches and nuclear tests, China could agree to warn Pyongyang that future provocations would be followed by a cutback in Chinese aid. Beijing could also insist that Pyongyang return to its commitments under the six-party talks or face substantial reductions in deliveries of crude oil, kerosene, diesel, and gasoline. And fifth, the U.S. should press China to not obstruct discussion in UN bodies on human rights abuses in North Korea. And my colleague Victor Cha has already underscored North Korea's sensitivity to this issue. Securing cooperation from China to increase pressure on North Korea may be more feasible than in the past. Xi Jinping is a decisive and bold leader who has a clear vision of what is needed to achieve what he calls the Chinese dream, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And under Xi's leadership, China has embarked on an effort to end the special relationship of the past between Beijing and Pyongyang and replace it with a normal state-to-state relationship. Widely viewed as the most powerful leader China has had since Deng Xiaoping, Xi Jinping has sufficient clout to overrule opposition from potent constituencies in China that would resist a tougher stance toward North Korea, especially in the party and the military. Beijing is not prepared to assume sole responsibility for addressing the North Korean nuclear threat, but China might be willing to do more along the lines that I have outlined if it believes that the U.S. has an effective strategy, is prioritizing the goal of creating a non-nuclear Korean peninsula, and does not seek to use the Korean peninsula to harm Chinese interests. What does China want? A balance of power in Northeast Asia that is favorable to Chinese interests and certainly does not threaten Chinese interests. I believe China does not adamantly oppose Korean unification, but the known burdens and dangers of the status quo today are less risky for China than the uncertainty that unification may bring for Chinese interests. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you again.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the distinguished panel members very much for making the time to be here today. You know, it's kind of unnerving when Seth Rogen gets more reaction out of the North Koreans than our American policies do. He certainly hit a nerve, you know, when he put that movie out, a lot more than any of the blustering that has been coming out of Washington, D.C. It's been a conundrum, as pointed out by my colleague Dana Rohrabacher, that's not new. It's not an issue that was resolved at one time and has degraded. It's never been resolved. And every time I've spoken with any expert about how to get North Korea to start living with accepted international norms, especially when it comes to proliferation, every one of those conversations always involves China, because they are the 800-pound gorilla when it comes to dealing with North Korea, because of North Korea's dependence on them for food and energy. And Ms. Glazer, you've made some very, I think, astute observations on what China could do. But how do we motivate them properly to get that done? There have been a lot of things talked about, maybe targeted sanctions that involve Chinese banks that fund North Korea. Maybe that is something we can look at. I spoke to Mr. Sherman about that, maybe looking at that in a bipartisan way. Mr. Klingner, you've said that in your submitted speech, your written speech, you're going to be talking about several of the sanctions that maybe could and should be on the table. I'd like us to really look at entertaining those. I think that the bill that was passed yesterday on the House floor was a good move. I think it moves the ball up the field, but I think there's even more to be done. You pointed out, rightly so, Mr. Klingner, that we haven't even considered or done similar things that we've done to far less egregious offenders in the world today. And I think that's abominable. I think we should put all things on the table. I'd like to ask you, Mr. Klingner, why do you think that there has been such restraint on dealing with North Korea in the same way that we've dealt with far less offenders? What's the rationale? It doesn't make any sense to me. Why have we been so reticent to do so?
That's an excellent question, sir, which I really don't have an answer to. It really is counterintuitive. You know, if you just compare Iran and North Korea, Iran remains in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. North Korea is out. Iran's claims that its nuclear program is for civilian purposes. North Korea quite clearly says it's to incinerate the U.S. and its allies. Iran has not exploded a nuclear device. North Korea has done 4, and Iran has oil. One would think we would have more pressure on North Korea than Iran, but we haven't. There are perhaps the concerns as to how North Korea will respond if we impose additional measures. I don't think we should be hesitant to enforce our laws because of the concerns of what the criminal will do if we enforce them. Similarly, as already been talked about, is how will China respond? You know, when I, advocated additional measures against North Korea, I've said, let the law enforcement people go where the evidence takes them. And someone commented to me that, oh, so you want to sacrifice the all-important U.S.-China relationship over North Korea? I'd say, well, no. What I'm saying is I don't want to give China immunity from U.S. law simply because they're China. So we should go where the evidence takes us. We should sanction whatever entities are violating U.S. and international law and UN resolutions, not because they're Chinese, but because they're violating our laws and the resolutions.
I think that your answer kind of dovetails with the opening statement of the ranking member, and I think that these comments really have a lot of bearing on going forward. I think that there really shouldn't be any sacred cows when it comes to enforcing our laws and protection of special interests or, ongoing concerns of our bilateral relationship with China. These are serious issues, and China has not stood up for its obligations, I believe, in this realm. One thing that has been mentioned that might get China's attention, and I think it's also just good policy, is what about the U.S. Bolstering our support for missile defense system for South Korea, at the least, and maybe Japan. What do you think about that, Dr. Cha, Mr. Klingner?
So I think that's a great idea. On the China piece of it, first, as Bruce said, when there was a Section 311 against a Chinese bank in Macau in 2005, that was a law enforcement action. It was a Chinese bank. And in the end, the U.S.-China relationship survived. And it was it was a very effective measure. And it actually may take things like that to actually motivate China. We're almost self-deterring in that sense, supposed equities in the relationship. With regard to measures with other countries in the region, I think absolutely. All of North Korea's activities speak to the need for a much more robust and networked missile defense system in Asia, including the United States, Japan, and South Korea. As was mentioned, the relationship between Japan and Korea has gone through some rough periods, but it's on the mend. And there are, I think, opportunities here, particularly in South Korea, to talk about more missile defense, as well as better intelligence and information sharing among the three countries. These have been on our agenda with our allies for quite some time, and we haven't been able to push them forward. Unfortunate as it is, when we were working on the policy, every time North Korea did something bad, the motto in the office was, well, let's make lemonade out of this lemon. And one of the ways to make lemonade out of this lemon is to really consolidate our defense alliances. And that also complicates the environment for China and may motivate them to do more.
Mr. Klingner.
Yes. Last year, I wrote a detailed research paper on that South Korea should allow the U.S. to deploy THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System. To date, the South Korean administration has not even wanted to publicly discuss it. And as I point out in the paper, that THAAD is better than anything the South Koreans have or will have for decades to come. It's much more capable. Also, point out, that the Chinese claims that it will impair their ability to assault the United States or our allies with missiles, they're red herrings. The THAAD is very effective against North Korean missiles, but it will have no constrainment on Chinese missiles, so that therefore that China's objections are politically based. So I think the U.S., in consultation with our allies, should deploy THAAD. It'll improve the defense of not only our forces there, but of South Korea. And also, as Dr. Cha said, to have South Korea integrate its system into the more comprehensive, effective allied system with Japan, because we're all in this together. The same North Korean missile could be aimed on the same trajectory towards South Korea, U.S. forces, or U.S. forces in Japan, which are critical for the defense of the Republic of Korea.
It's no secret that the relationship between China and South Korea has blossomed over the last several years, and they've tried to do everything they can to improve trade and all aspects of that bilateral relationship. It's also no secret that China has lobbied, and I think that's the understatement of the universe, South Korea against that. And I think it's time for us as leaders in the region to step up our voices and our commitment to security in the region by support for things like that, and try to reignite some support for those things, because maybe, just maybe, besides being good policy from our strategic interests, self-strategic interests, it might be a really good motivation factor for China to finally get off its duff and do something about this serious global problem. Chair recognizes Mr. Sherman.
Usually it's the witnesses that answer questions, but one question has come up, and that is, why did we do it in Iran and not North Korea? So I think I'll answer the question. When Congress passed the sanctions laws, they provided secondary sanctions, which is the only way you go after these regimes, that if the law had been enforced, would have made Iran's trading partners very angry. Administrations refused to enforce those laws, gave Iran a lot more time to get very close to a nuclear weapon, but they began to persuade Iran's trading partners that they should go along with this pressure, and only to the extent that we could carry out the sanctions regime without angering Iran's major trading partners did we carry it out. And we used persuasion. And who we were persuading? Europe. So we had sanctions on Iran only to the extent that we could get Europe not to be terribly angry if we forced them to go along. As to China, persuading them will be considerably more difficult. And so the chairman and I are talking about, for example, sanctions on Chinese banks. That will make China angry. In dealing with Iran, the administration got as far as it did without making anybody really angry, any of Iran's trading partners. I think this North Korean nuclear program is significant enough that we should be willing to make China angry. Now, I might talk about a tariff on their goods. That would make them angrier than I could persuade my colleagues in Congress to go along with. But they'll be pretty angry with the banking sanctions. Dr. Cha, you say there's some who doubt that North Korea is legally a terrorist state. One act of terrorism is when you seize civilian hostages. And that act of terrorism continues at least until you release the hostages. And if you seize Japanese homemakers and hold them hostage for decades because you want somebody to teach you how to pour tea, that's an act of terrorism. Dr. Cha, is there any doubt that North Korea is engaged in terrorism until they release the hostages they've seized, or their bodies for those who have died?
You have no disagreement from me there,
Okay.
Congressman. I think that there have been many actions in that vein, almost a regular state practice of detaining innocent individuals, Americans and other nationalities in the country for no apparent reason, and that's just unacceptable. My only point was that I think that the other area that that we could investigate in terms of criteria for putting them back on the list is the cyber area. The
cyber terrorism is bad enough, but when you seize people and hold them for decades because you want somebody to teach you a tea ceremony,
yeah.
One comment, and that is, North Korea is very status conscious. They want to bestride. And, of course, the biggest boost to your ego is to have a nuclear-tipped ICBM. The cheesy way to deliver a nuclear weapon is to smuggle one. But I will point out that you can smuggle a nuclear weapon inside a bale of marijuana, and a missile defense program isn't going to stop that. And in fact, you have the additional advantage of having plausible deniability or a delay. So retaliation doesn't occur in cold blood. It doesn't occur after a 90-day investigatory process. I want to go to one more line of questioning. Al-Kabar in Syria, North Korean technology. Just a quick question. Does any of our witnesses have any guess as to how much money North Korea was given for cooperating with Al-Kabar? I'm not seeing any witnesses. What we do, the estimates have been in the hundreds of millions of dollars. We know two things. Iran wants a nuclear weapon. Iran's about to get its hands on $130 billion. Would North Korea be willing to sell, they've already proven they're willing to sell nuclear weapons kits, if you will, or equipment and plans. Does North Korea have enough atomic weapons that they'd be willing to sell one or two of them? And is this a multi-billion-dollar cost for whoever wants to buy them? Do we have Mr. Klinger?
I was going to address your comment about North Korea as a terrorist nation, if I could. In my written testimony, I have a long list of actions that North Korea has taken, which I think fulfill the legal obligation for relisting them as a terrorist nation. There are a number of U.S. statutes. Perhaps the most relevant is 18 U.S. Code 2331, which defines international terrorism as involving violent acts that would be a violation of criminal laws of the U.S. and that appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population. I think the threats of a 9/11 type attack for citizens of the U.S. or inhabitants of the U.S. to go to theaters to watch that movie is considered trying to coerce a population. And there have been a number of items that I've listed of North Korean attempts at assassination and kidnapping and that have been recognized by South Korean courts. So I think any one of those should have put North Korea back on the U.S. list, and certainly cumulatively. As for whether North Korea would sell a nuclear weapon, as you correctly point out, they've shared and sold nuclear and missile technology with a list of rogue nations. I question whether they would sell a completed weapon, though. I think it might go beyond what they would be willing to do, but I certainly could be very wrong on that. Certainly as they develop a larger arsenal, they might be more willing to do so.
What I've said in this room is they need their first 12 atomic weapons to defend themselves from us. The 13th doesn't go on eBay, but could be available for sale. Dr. Chuck.
Well, there's certainly a history there. I mean, every major weapon system the North Koreans have ever developed, they've sold. And
they haven't drawn the line at nuclear. I mean, had things gone as planned, Syria or Iran operating in combination at Al-Kabar would have a plutonium nuclear device, and it's not that North Korea says, oh, that's so immoral we couldn't participate in that.
So it's definitely a concern. Both in the case of, as you know well, their missile cells, that's certainly been the case. And I think part of their effort at trying to develop longer range and more accurate missiles are to sell them. So you can't put it past them in terms of the nuclear side. But even aside from the sort of overt proliferation, just by virtue of the fact that they have a nuclear arsenal that's growing, creates all sort of very serious crisis instability problems for the United States. I mean, the notion that they can keep a dozen or 2 dozen bombs, and as long as we deter them, we're safe, is completely wrong. Because should any crisis develop on the peninsula, North Korea is developing these nuclear capabilities at the expense of massive degrading of their conventional capabilities. And so what that means is if we're ever in a military crisis, they immediately have to shoot up the escalation ladder, and that immediately forces us to consider preemption. So it's a highly unstable situation that I think gets lost among the general public because, as the chairman said,
Doctor, I've gone way over time. I yield back.
Yeah.
I did too, so I was looking the other way. Chair recognizes Mr. Rohrabacher.
I'll try not to go over time. First of all, let me thank the witnesses. Your testimony has been of great value to me and to this committee, and the points that you've made, all of you, I mean, you've made some very serious points and given us information that we will utilize in this coming year as we try to come up with a policy that can deal with this threat. It's ironic. I believe the United States and the world is entering a new era. The Cold War is being left behind a long way, and even the post-Cold War era is being left behind now. And what the new era will be, what is the parameters of how we operate in the world is going to be different. And ironically, the country that may be and the government that may be forcing us into a new definition of what our responsibilities are and what we're going to do is one of the most anachronistic regimes in the world. I mean, they don't even fit into the Cold War. I mean, the way they handle themselves. I really appreciate the information also about the specifics that the North Korean government is doing and the actual people who are running the North Korean government put up with in terms of the idea of slavery, that they are actually engaged in slavery, which I think is an important, you have made an important point today. I mean, this is what that type of activity is intolerable. And those thousands of North Korean workers that are being sent overseas and all of their salary being given to the government, that is, I believe, a virtual slavery. And thank you for drawing our attention to that. That's something we should be able to deal with and something we should be able to work with and with international organizations. Let me note that I agree with and I'm very pleased that the ranking member, Mr. Sherman, has pointed out that the North Koreans are still holding Japanese hostages after decades. And I agree with him. That should not just be overlooked as if that's a past issue. The fact that the North Koreans are kidnapped and are holding Japanese civilians in North Korea is something that should be a matter that is not relegated to the past, as long as they are holding these people. And that should be part of what we're looking at. Whatever we know, whatever era we're entering, we know it's going to be different. And I think that what may come of all of this is that we may find that reunification of Korea becomes a reality after all of these decades, and that reunification will itself create a new world that we have to deal with. We're talking about historic moments in the world. That's where we're at, and it's being brought about by this crazy regime up in North Korea is forcing these changes upon us. I would also like to mention that we are now entering an era also of where our technology is not just being utilized for offensive weapon systems. And thanks to Ronald Reagan, we started down a path of building and focusing on defensive systems, which make a lot more sense to me, even especially in cases like this, where, and let me note, there are several new technologies being developed that will give us even a greater ability to defend ourselves against a missile attack. And we certainly should make that available to South Korea and to Japan. And that would certainly be a message there. Let me ask again for some more information from you folks. Somewhere in the back of my mind is an action that we took, and I believe I don't know if it's covert action, maybe I'm just disclosing something, to prevent a transfer of money that was going to specific individuals in the North Korean government We know that North Korea, with all of its poverty and the lack of food, hasn't prevented luxury cars and booze and very expensive consumer items to going to their very elite. And I understand, and I seem to remember that there were banking transactions that we challenged in some way that had an impact on North Korean policy. Could you refresh my memory on that? And is that a methodology that we should try to look at now to reestablish that policy towards the new challenge that we face? Dr. Cha?
Yes, I think what you're referring to, Congressman, is the Section 311 by the Treasury Department in 2005 that advised U.S. financial institutions not to deal with a particular bank in Macau because of money laundering concerns. And so in the press, it's always talked about how we sanctioned North Korea financially. What we did was we advised U.S. financial institutions to be wary of business with a particular bank, and that then created a ripple effect that you described, where many other banks that had North Korean accounts decided, well, we're going to freeze these or we're going to investigate them. Bank presidents, regulators, all started to target these accounts, and it had the effect of completely shutting North Korea off from the international financial system. They could not do a wire transfer. They could not access bank accounts through ATMs. It was really quite a powerful and forceful thing. And in answer to your question, yes, I think that we can do that again. North Korea has since tried to adjust, but at the same time, they still are able to operate in the financial system, and there are things that we can do to make that much more difficult.
Are we talking about bank accounts that are being controlled and do operate for the benefit of the leadership of specific leaders of North Korea and decision makers there?
I can't give you the answer to that question here. What I can say is that when that action happened, the North Korean negotiators, when they came back to the negotiation table, had only one demand, and that was to unfreeze the $25 million that was sitting in that bank in Macau. They did not want to talk about anything else under the sun. They didn't want to talk about peace treaty. They didn't want to talk about anything else. All they wanted to talk about was that, which gives you a sense of how important it was to them.
Do the other witnesses have any comment on that? Yes.
Congressman, I think that this also takes us back to the issue of China, where there are so many of these small banks that exist along the border, and sometimes they shut down and they pop up someplace else, maybe even half a mile down the road. There are some journalists who have gotten into some of these banks and pretended to make transactions just to demonstrate how easy it is to transfer money to North Korea. So again, this goes back to the issue you raised earlier of shutting down these banking transactions, putting sanctions on these banks. This is it is just essential to get the Chinese to comply with the sanctions that are already on the books, that the Chinese have supported in the United Nations. And when it comes to things like luxury goods, just inspections along the border, they're episodic. There are times that the Chinese appear to want to signal the North Koreans that they're dissatisfied with something, and then they go back to business as usual.
If I could just add, we talk about Chinese resistance, the Chinese government resistance to actions, but we can actually get Chinese banks to work in our interests. With the Banco Delta Asia issue, as I mentioned before, the U.S. Sent officials throughout Asia, including to the Bank of China, to talk and point out that under Section 311 they could face seizure of their assets in the United States and be precluded from accessing the U.S. financial system, which really is a kiss of death for any financial institution. Even though the Chinese government was urging the Chinese banks to resist any pressure, the banks themselves had to worry about their own reputational risk, their own access to the international system. So they complied. They severed, Bank of China, for example, severed its relationship with North Korea, even if the Chinese government didn't want it, but they had to take those actions themselves to maintain the Bank of China as an entity.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our panel. I begin by taking issue with the ranking member's narrative with respect to Iran and comparing it to North Korea. My narrative would be that this administration took up from the neglect and fecklessness of the previous administration with respect to Iran, and whether you like it or not, the agreement, the nuclear agreement, is working. They're complying. And if you want to remove an existential threat to Israel, that's the way we did it. And it's going, you know, in my view, it has the best probability of working of any solution offered on the table. Maybe one doesn't like that. Maybe one would have preferred a different alternative. But this is the one the United States government pursued. I'm glad they did. And I think in the long run, it will be the best alternative for peace in the region and for taking the nuclear option with respect to Iran off the table. Now, one of the pieces of leverage we had, in addition to sanctions, was choking off Iran's ability to sell the one product it really has, and that's oil. When it comes to North Korea, we don't have an analogous situation other than weapons. I'm not quite sure what it is the North Koreans really have to sell that we can choke off. Would that be a fair statement, Ms. Glazer?
Yes, I would agree with you, Congressman. I don't know what North Korea has to sell that we can choke off, but
that's a real big difference between, I mean, to analogize North Korea and Iran, I just think it's apples and oranges, because start with the fact that Iran's got oil, North Korea doesn't have anything, other than maybe weapons.
there are some very important differences, of course, between North Korea and Iran, beginning with the fact that North Korea has nuclear weapons and has tested them, and Iran is not. But at the same time, I would agree with the points that have been made by Bruce Klingner and Victor Cha, that there are mechanisms that we have used, sanctions that we have used, executive authorities we have used against Iran that exist that we have not used against North Korea. So there are many more ways that we could pressure North Korea that we have applied to Iran, I believe, fairly successfully, but have not applied to North Korea.
Let me ask that question, and I welcome Dr. Cha, Mr. Klinger, but it's a devil's advocate question, I'm not promoting it, but is that the best way to try to restrain and shape North Korea behavior? Tighten sanctions, tighten economic consequences, because they will have to scream uncle at some point. Is that really what history tells us about North Korea? Ms. Glazer? And the other, both of the other panelists are free to comment as well.
My view is that it must be part of any strategy. In itself, if we are not offering North Korea some positive vision of the future, then pressure sanctions are unlikely to work.
Alone. Yeah.
But I believe that the United States, under this administration and prior administrations, have made it quite clear to North Korea that there are many things that we can put on the table: security assurances, assistance, diplomatic relations. There is such thing as a, if you want to call it, a grand bargain. The North Koreans are aware that there would be benefits from them, if they give up their nuclear weapons. So pressure by itself, of course, will not work. But pressure, sanctions must be part of any strategy.
Dr. Cha, Mr. Klinger.
Yeah, I agree. And even though my comments today have focused on sanctions, when I've talked about these in other fora in the past, I've always emphasized the context of that it is one instrument.
And not always an effective one.
Right, just as diplomacy has not been effective. So,
Right.
you know, when we often get into a binary debate of sanctions versus engagement, and we need both. I mean, it's part of a comprehensive integrated strategy. So, you know, we need the continued offers of conditional engagement based on conditionality, reciprocity, transparency. Unfortunately, we've had many agreements, 4 agreements for them never to pursue nuclear weapons, and then 4 agreements to give up the weapons they promised never to build in the first place. Additional pressure, and then also those 2 tracks we hope will convince North Korea to alter its behavior, then you also need the third track of having to ensure that you have sufficient defenses for yourself and your allies. But when people say sanctions don't work because North Korea hasn't cut up its weapons, well, diplomacy was equally unable to do that. But sanctions have a number of other purposes. One is to enforce U.S. law. Two is to impose a penalty, a cost, a pain when someone violates our law or international law or UN resolutions, and hopefully a deterrent to other would-be violators. Three is to put into place mechanisms to impede the inflow of prohibited items, components for their nuclear and missile programs, and the money from illicit activities. Four, to prevent or at least constrain proliferation. And five, the most difficult, is to alter their behavior. I would argue on 4 of the 5 that they've had some success.
Thoughtful, thank you. Dr. Cha.
Say very quickly on the Congressman about the question about what do they export that's of value. I mean, it's really what is of value to them. And so a couple of things come to mind in addition to the things that Bruce has already talked about. One, as I mentioned before, is this issue of slave labor. That is providing income to them. It's something that is clearly in violation of ILO standards, even though they're not a signatory to the ILO. And that's certainly one area where it's not Iranian oil, but it's something that certainly is of value to them. The other is there's a lot of raw materials actually in North Korea, and China since 2008 has extracted a lot of that for their 2 inland provinces. And when people are in Pyongyang, the capital city of North Korea, they say things look pretty good there now. That's all because of Chinese money from these contracts, and that's another area. On the diplomacy side, no, I don't think anybody on this panel is against diplomacy. I think we all believe diplomacy is important. But I have to say that having participated in negotiations for the last agreements with North Korea, the nuclear agreements, and knowing a lot about the Clinton administration agreements and President Obama's, we've put, I mean, as Bonnie said, they know what they get. We've put everything on the table. And the issue right now is that this young leader is not interested. And he's looking to build his programs because he wants to confront the next administration here.
Yeah. If the chair would allow me one more question, and I'll try to ask Ms. Glades to be brief, but talk a little bit more about, it seems to me the one sort of inflection point we've got, if we've got leverage on North Korea, it's through China. It's in our relationship with China and their relationship with Pyongyang. How much leverage do the Chinese really have? Because from a distance, it looks like the Chinese are in a conundrum themselves. They've got relationships they don't want to walk away from. They don't want to even unwittingly destabilize the peninsula and have to deal with that mess. I mean, if you gave them truth serum, they'd probably love a peaceful reunification organized by the South, but that's so far away, they can't really effectuate that. So how much leverage do the Chinese have, and how well are we pressuring them to try to effectuate better behavior from the North Koreans?
Well, the Chinese, as I said in my earlier remarks, have enormous potential leverage. They are unwilling to use it. And because the Chinese are fearful of instability in North Korea, the leverage they have, in essence, becomes North Korea's leverage over them. Kim Jong-un and even his father, I think, have done quite a good job of playing a very weak hand, not only with the United States and other countries, but particularly with China. And so the North Koreans, I think, occasionally cause trouble for China in a variety of ways along the border and in terms of the threats that they make towards South Korea. So the Chinese need, I think, to be motivated to use the pressure that they have. And I don't think we have done a very good job of doing that. I agree that we should not be self-deterred in putting pressure on China. We should not be worried that if we put pressure on China on this issue, that they will somehow not cooperate with us on climate change or Iran, for example. We can use pressure if properly applied and well-timed, I think can have an impact on Chinese behavior. And I would cite the example of when Xi Jinping was preparing to come to the United States last September. and the administration considered imposing cyber sanctions and had the executive authorities to do so. And the Chinese got very motivated to set up a new mechanism to send a standing member of the Politburo to discuss this issue. Now, this may not, in the end, solve the problem of the cyber hacking and cyber-enabled theft, and I think we certainly have to keep their feet to the fire on that issue. But the point is that when you threaten sanctions, when you have the executive authorities to do so, and the Chinese take you seriously, that yes, you can motivate their behavior. There was also the discussion earlier about bolstering missile defense in the region, and I do think that taking steps that defend American interests and the interests of our allies. And if they happen to create a more negative security environment for China in the region, that may motivate the Chinese to do more as well. This is not something that they want to see. It doesn't benefit their interests.
I thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence.
Mr. Connolly raised the issue that they don't really have much to export. Possibly they could export some cyber hacking training seminars. Chair recognizes Mr. Desjardins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel of witnesses for your thoughtful insight today. Dr. Cha, I wanted to ask you, do you believe that North Korea would use their nuclear weapons for aggressive actions?
I don't think it's the intent of any nuclear weapon state, including North Korea, to use them purposely for aggressive purposes. Having said that, there are easily contingencies one can imagine where a country, especially North Korea, can miscalculate. And I can draw out some of those scenarios for you in which they have no intent to use nuclear weapons, but because of military miscalculations, they are then compelled to. And that is what's so inherently destabilizing about the current situation.
Well, I just want to talk a little bit about perception. I've not been to South Korea. I've not been to Japan. Do South Koreans and Japanese feel the same threat from North Korea that, say, Israel does with Iran?
I certainly think that Japan feels mortally threatened by the developments in North Korea, their missile program as well as their nuclear program. It's the clearest existential threat to Japan today. With regard to South Korea, they've always been under the fear of artillery attack from North Korea. Artillery tubes are only seconds away from the capital city of Seoul. And I think there is now a growing concern about the broader nuclear question. Again, if you've been under conventional military threat, biochemical artillery shells all your life, you can get a little jaded. But I think that there is a growing concern about the broader strategic implications of North Korea's nuclear program.
Okay, and I'm going somewhere with this. My sense is that, you know, here in this country, we have a country, the only one in this century testing nuclear weapons, detonate a nuclear weapon a week ago. But after the news comes out, it's like, oh, well, it wasn't a thermonuclear weapon. It was just a fission weapon, and therefore we don't need to worry about it. We are having a hearing today, but I will tell you that every member of Congress understands the threat Israel feels from Iran. It is something that Israel has done to raise that perception, and I think that everyone has learned to respect that threat. And I'm not sure that's the same with North Korea. And you know, maybe our problem is that we need to raise that perception. Every member of Congress, Democrat or Republican, generally takes a trip to Israel when they first go to Congress, and they see and they feel that threat. You know, maybe that's something Japan and something South Korea and other nations that feel threatened in the region should do to help increase that perception here in Congress. Because honestly, right now, I mean, you hear the news about Syria, you hear the news about ISIS, you hear about the Iran deal. It's sucking up all the oxygen. That is what people are paying attention to. So you all have a lot of great ideas of what to do, but how do we get action? And that's, you know, why we're here today. So in your opinion, what do we do to elevate the reality that this is a real threat? Because I've been sitting here with my colleague, Mr. Perry, talking about, you know, this problem should just be solved, but yet it's not happening. It doesn't seem that hard, but apparently it is. So what would you suggest? And I'll give each of the panelists a chance to respond, 30 seconds each.
So I would entirely agree with you, Congressman, that I think outside of this chamber, more broadly in the American public, there is a tendency to downgrade, discount, dismiss North Korean activities as basically a crazy regime that blows up bombs in a cave somewhere near China, and that we don't have to worry about that. And I think that's completely the wrong attitude. In part, it's been because there was a feeling that the United States sometimes overreacted in the past to North Korean actions and played into their hand. I think we are now in a period in which we're underreacting, and I think that's very dangerous.
Thank you, Mr. Klingner.
North Korea is easy to ridicule, and it's easy to make the butt of jokes, as members of the panel have pointed out. It is a very real threat, a nuclear threat, a biological, chemical threat, conventional forces, cyber threat, human rights threat. It runs the gamut, and it's not only against our allies, but increasingly to the United States. Last year, 3 U.S. 4-star commanders said that North Korea has a nuclear weapon that could hit the United States today. They must know something. A year or so ago, South Korean press had a lot of articles from defectors about Kim Jong-un had directed a new war plan be implemented or created after he came into office, so that North Korea could take over the peninsula in 7 days before the U.S. could flow reinforcements there. That would require, as directed in that war plan, the use of nuclear weapons. It is a real threat.
Thank you, Ms. Glasner.
It is also disheartening to me that there is an underappreciation for how much of a threat North Korea's nuclear weapons poses. And of course, Israel does such a terrific job in Congress and in the American public at large. I think more can be done in the area of public education, and certainly hearings such as this and on North Korea's human rights record, I think would be very important in highlighting this issue. More actions up at the United Nations as well to get more people involved in this discussion, help people to understand that we need to really to dissect what the threat is, see that it is increasingly an existential threat, and not just put this on the back burner. So I completely agree I share your concern.
I thank the panel, and thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Gabbard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate Mr. Desjardins bringing up this issue and each of you expressing your shared concerns about this underappreciation and really a lack of understanding about the threat. I represent Hawaii's 2nd District here, and as you can imagine, being out there in the middle of the Pacific, every time North Korea starts making threats, launching these tests, this is something, knowing, as you said, Mr. Klingner, Hawaii and the West Coast at a minimum already are within range of North Korea's capabilities, both of an ICBM as well as a nuclear weapon. So this is something that really rings true and is deeply understood by folks in my state who recognize the need for stronger missile defense, who recognize the need for taking this threat with the seriousness that it deserves. I've got a few questions. The sanctions bill that we passed yesterday, in particular as it relates to hard currency, do you believe that it'll have the same effect as in 2005 when it was first put in place, for whomever would like to answer?
I think the bill's great, and I think that the mechanism is still there to carry out the same sorts of targeted financial sanctioning. North Korea, since 2005, has tried to circumvent this. But again, a lot of it depends on what entities we choose to sanction, what individuals we choose to target, and Chinese compliance with that. Having said that, I can easily imagine things that we can do that would not collapse the U.S.-China relationship, or as Mr. Sherman said earlier, not have a major effect on Wall Street. So there's plenty of room to operate. Yes.
That will directly impact their pocketbook.
Yes.
So along those lines, when we look back to what happened in 2005 and what led to their agreement in 2007 when those sanctions were lifted, I'd just like to hear your thoughts on what you see is a viable path forward should that end be reached, should these sanctions be so effective that we get to a point where we've got an opportunity there. Understanding really that North Korea sees their nuclear program as an insurance policy against regime change, seeing what they learned from what happened in Libya with Gaddafi, and really what caused their, I think that window, frankly, to close, where they wouldn't trust that if there was an agreement to denuclearize, that the United States wouldn't go after them to try to implement a regime change. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts on engagement with North Korea and how, understanding this climate, there is a path forward.
Just commenting on yesterday's bill, it closes a number of loopholes. It elevates a number of existing executive orders or regulations to legislation, giving it additional power. It makes a number of implementations mandatory rather than discretionary. So I think it has will provide a number of benefits to the U.S. effort. But the bill, as well as existing measures, it's a lot dependent on the implementation and our willingness to use the powers we already have. Last year, the executive order that was released in January allows the U.S. to sanction North Korean officials simply for being North Korean officials. Yeah. We don't even have to provide evidence that they've conducted illegal activity. That gives us tremendous power. The U.S. sanctioned 16 Russian officials for being Russian officials after the Crimea incursion. Yeah. We haven't used that power as much as we could. The target has changed. Banco Delta Asia was very effective because it was a very large conduit. North Korea has adapted since then. But it's sort of like the cockroach theory of law enforcement. You go into a kitchen, you turn on the light, you see where the cockroaches are and where they run off to. If you take out the first node, the plan A of North Korea, you then alert your intelligence and law enforcement authorities so they watch where the money gets redirected, where the cockroaches go. Right. It's then you go after the plan B.
Right.
On the issue of engagement, Congressman, we talked about earlier, we have to have a strategy that deals with, it is composed of engagement as well as coercive steps. As far as I understand, the United States engages with North Korea. We have the channel in New York. We do talk to the North Koreans. But I think we have to be careful about agreeing to revive the six-party talks mechanism, as the Chinese often encourage us to do, in the absence of some return to the commitments that the North Koreans made under the 2005 and other agreements. Now, the North Koreans want to engage in dialogue so that they can get a peace treaty and be recognized as a nuclear weapon state. I think that's a bad outcome for the United States and our interests and our allies. So we have to engage North Korea in a way that they understand that there are steps that they have to take. They have to go back to these commitments of giving up nuclear weapons. And if they're willing to go ahead with a freeze as a first step, with the understanding that the goal is that they eventually give them up, then I think the United States has always been willing to work with that. I don't think there are signs that under Kim Jong-un that the North Koreans are willing to engage in serious negotiations with the end goal of denuclearizing the peninsula. So I think that engagement, yes, but we have to be careful about how we use it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing and for continuing to help increase awareness on North Korea's threat.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes Brigadier General Perry.
Congressman Perry, you'll be fine. Thank you. Thanks to the chairman. Thanks to the panel. List of questions here, maybe just all at once, and if you'd comment, understand what we're reportedly in talks with South Korea regarding the reintroduction of nuclear weapons, United States nuclear weapons onto the peninsula. What is the status of that, if you know? Why wouldn't South Korea be interested? Regarding the introduction of THAAD, the Missile Defense Interceptor System, why not? Why is South Korea concerned that it would be too provocative? Why wouldn't they want that? Regarding curtailing conventional arms sales, how would that be done? Again, if I've been listening as everybody else has the whole time, saying, why aren't we doing this? And you folks are the experts, and you don't know. But maybe you can give me some insight into that. And regarding increasing the pressure on their human rights atrocities, which are just unimaginable to me. What's the best way? what's the best way to do that? From my standpoint, I, like you folks, don't understand at all why we're not imposing these financial sanctions out of hand. Like with your morning coffee, to me, the president should just sign that and move on to the next terrain feature. But that's my perception. What would be the response to some of these things from our allies and trading partners in the region? Thank you.
Okay, I'll take a piece of those, and then I'll look to Bruce to take other pieces of it. In terms of the why, why haven't we done more question? One aspect of this is China, and we've had a very full discussion on that. I think the other part of it is that it's priority and commitment. This has not been a priority, unfortunately, even though, as I said, it's a very dangerous situation. And there has to be a political commitment to make the North Korean regime feel like they're a cost to their behavior. There's been a political commitment to create the machinery, but there hasn't been a political commitment to implement. I think part of the reason there hasn't been that is that there's always been some hope that there's a chance for diplomacy, like with Iran, like with Cuba, or like with Myanmar. But I am of the view that we're not going to see any diplomacy till the end of this administration.
If I can interrupt you, is there a downside risk? Because I don't see a whole lot of downside risk. I understand that there's no commitment to go on the upside, and you might expend some capital or whatever. I just don't see any, like, what do we lose by doing this?
Well, I think the primary downside has to do with China and the relationship with China. At least that is the perceived downside. And then there's a degree of inertia, I think. There really is a degree of inertia because this is an issue traditionally that administrations want to put on the shelf. They don't necessarily want to commit to solve it. They want to put it on the shelf, and so there's almost a pattern to this. They do a provocation, we issue a statement, we slap a sanction on them, and then everybody goes back to dealing with other issues, and that is a rapidly deteriorating situation.
If I could address them in reverse order, on human rights atrocities, as I have in my statement, a number of cases where we've imposed sanctions and measures on other countries for their human rights violations, but not North Korea. We have the authority to do so. Obviously, we've done it to other countries, and also the executive order of last January, which gives us the authority to sanction someone for being a member of the government. Tomorrow, with his morning coffee, the president could add, 50 North Korean entities, including Kim Jong-un by name, as well as every agency named in the UN Commission of Inquiry report, as well as the heads of all those agencies. I don't know why we don't do that. Curtailing conventional arms sales. The UN resolutions not only cover the nuclear and missile programs, they also prevent trade on conventional arms. There have been at least 3 interceptions of conventional arms shipments from North Korea to other nations, but apparently in the resolution sanction busting hierarchy, they're not worth enforcing because they didn't even convene UN meetings about those violations. So one thing we should be pushing for at the UN is Chapter 7, Clause 42 authority, which allows military enforcement of the UN resolutions. That doesn't mean attack, it doesn't mean invasion, but it provides the authority for, say, Coast Guard interception of ships. We've had cases where the U.S. warships have been trailing North Korean freighters for hundreds of miles because we didn't have the authority to board or inspect them. On THAAD, I can send you a copy of my report on THAAD. South Korea has been hesitant, I believe, because of Chinese pressure and economic blackmail. But last night, during a major speech, President Park Geun-hye, I think for the first time, her administration said they want to discuss with the United States the possible deployment of THAAD to the peninsula. And reintroducing nuclear weapons, that's very contentious. Both the U.S. and South Korean governments have said they don't see a military necessity of putting U.S. nuclear weapons on the ground in South Korea because we have sea-based and air-based weapons which can do the job and wouldn't provide a sort of preemptive target in South Korea for North Korea.
If I could just add briefly, Congressman, President Park has attached a great deal of priority to China, hopes to gain China's support ultimately for reunification, but also in the near term for putting more pressure on China. And I agree with my colleagues that I think that is the main issue with THAAD. I don't think that President Park is unmovable on this issue, and with the growing threat, she may agree. But the Chinese seek to weaken U.S. alliances. And this is a major problem in trying to deal with the North Korea problem. Unless we can have a bigger strategy with the Chinese, make this a priority, and perhaps give China some of the reassurances that Congressman Sherman was talking about earlier. If we really have a reunified peninsula and we don't need to necessarily have troops along China's border. The Chinese are very concerned, though, that the situation could be far more detrimental to them today than in the future than it is today. I also think there's an issue with the United States giving China credit for very small steps it takes, for example, supporting a UN Security Council resolution, that it has diluted, prevented the application, for example, of economic sanctions, banking sanctions, just because the United States wants to isolate North Korea. And that is a valuable goal. Yes, we should seek to isolate North Korea, but at the same time, we should be putting far greater pressure on China to do more. And the Chinese believe that the United States is not prioritizing this issue. They see us as having put this on the back burner, and so little incentive for them to attach a priority to it either.
Yeah, I think we just continue to reward bad behavior, and as much as the Chinese are, I think, doing a delicate dance with their economy and their political system, at the end of the day, I think that it serves their purpose to have North Korea remain communist or totalitarian. They are communists at their heart, and that's what they want to maintain. And with all due respect to South Korea and the president, I understand what she's trying to get to, but at their heart, they are communists, and that's who they are. But thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the hearing.
I'd like to really thank the panel members. I think that this has been an incredibly productive hearing. Congressman Perry, you asked a lot of questions. I think that a lot of us have been entertaining ourselves. You know, a lot of the whys. Why, you know, is North Korea less of a threat than they were several years ago when there was tons of media attention and concern across America? And just 3 short years ago in the presidential debates, it was front and center, one of the most important issues of our time. And the only thing that kind of comes to mind is an old adage: if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, did it make a sound? And we just haven't focused the attention. When I say we, I don't think it's been a priority for the last 3 years. And
the question I have is what's it going to take?
And
that's scary.
I think that's why we're here today, because in the absence of leadership on this issue, I think that realm falls to us. That we have a responsibility then to stand up and try to take matters into our hands, whether it's trying to influence South Korea on THAAD, or whether it's looking at potential new sanctions, or at the very least redeclaring North Korea a terrorist state. There are lots of options, I think, that are on the table, and that's the reason that we did the hearing today. Not just to shine light, not just to talk, but I think our goal is to try to put together legislation, a bill or several bills that will try to move us in the right direction. And my intention is to work with the panelists to try to craft that legislation and mark it up for a full committee hearing, because while other parts of the globe are in jeopardy, that doesn't diminish the threat that this part of the globe holds. And just because we're not paying attention to it doesn't mean that it's not a serious threat. And I think that it's time that we refocus our attentions on this serious issue that poses a threat to not just our national security, our allies' national security, but global national security. The threat of a nut job like Kim Jong-un having deployment capabilities with a nuclear weapon is incredibly frightening. I think one of the things we didn't talk about today, what about the possibility, even if it's remote, what about the possibility of a partnership between North Korea and Iran, with all the money that Iran now has or will have, and nuclear capabilities in North Korea? What about the possibility of joining forces to become an uber threat to everything that we hold dear. So I think that this hearing is not an ending place. It's a beginning place for what needs to take our attention. I think, Mr. Chairman, you wanted to make a comment.
As to our attention, they say in journalism, if it bleeds, it leads. The Middle East, therefore, gets the attention, and it deserves some attention, but this North Korean problem is a threat to Asia and the United States. And then as to the possible connection between North Korea and Iran, we need an agreement with China that there are no nonstop flights between North Korea and Iran. They would all go over Chinese airspace. We don't have to make a big political deal. Just inform the planes that if they want to fly over your airspace, they got to stop in a Chinese city for refueling. It would be unsafe for them to go that extra mile all the way up without stopping for refueling. And if that happens, I'm sure the Chinese will take a look at the plane. If we don't have that, the money is there on the one hand, the desire for nuclear weapons, and the 12th or the 13th nuclear weapon goes on eBay. I yield back.
I think what's really clear is that we have to break outside the existing paradigm, and the status quo is not working. And so we have to be creative and start coming up with some maybe old ideas with oomph, or some new ideas. And I'm open. And so thank you very much for the panelists. Thank you, Ranking Member, and the committee members as well. This meeting is now adjourned.